Our survey of the history of the interpretation of the Tanakh continues now with the introduction of tradition criticism. Before we get into the prominent tradition critics, let's think for a moment about how tradition criticism arises from the context of source criticism and form criticism. The problem that led to the rise of tradition criticism is that form criticism never achieved the lofty goal that Gunkel himself had set out for it, because it was never able to achieve that synthesis that Gunkel sought of the reconstruction of the intellectual and spiritual life of the people of Israel. So by Gunkel's own standards, his approach, form critical approach, was never really successful, because form criticism, like the documentary hypothesis before it, became bogged down in a series of debates over minor details. In the case of source criticism, it was the source to which certain individual words or phrases or passages had to be described. In the case of form criticism, the debate was over the forms themselves, over the nature of the forms, how to identify them, how many there were, and so forth. And this is because, as we pointed out before, the problem with Gunkel's theory was that the real world of the biblical text didn't look like Gunkel said that it ought to look. And so that gave rise to these debates over the forms that never really were resolved within form criticism. This led eventually and gradually to the development of two alternative approaches, both of which have been called tradition criticism in English, although they have different names in German. So on one hand, one kind of tradition criticism consists of studies of the content of the tradition, or focus on the theological content of the traditions. In German studies, this is known as Traditionsgeschichte, the history of traditions. The other kind of approach, also sometimes called form or tradition criticism in English, is a study of the process of transmission, the process by which these traditions are handed down and eventually come to be merged together. The German term for this is Überlieferungsgeschichte. So these two different approaches are both called tradition criticism in English, and that sometimes leads to some confusion over what it is the author is intending to do. So we have these two approaches that gradually emerge from within form criticism. And because the process of change was relatively slow and not marked by the kind of dramatic alternative that form criticism had presented to source criticism, early tradition critics thought of themselves as form critics, and they typically described what they were doing as form criticism. So as a result, this also sometimes leads to a little confusion for English speakers who don't necessarily have a clear understanding of what was actually going on in these developments in Europe in the first part of the 20th century. Over time, however, the special emphasis within tradition criticism became clear as it became increasingly obvious that the focus of tradition criticism was not on the kind of forms, literary forms, and their backgrounds that Gunkel was talking about, but rather the focus was on how the individual traditions that were held by various people groups came together to form the larger body of thought that is the theology of the Old Testament. And this led to a redefinition of a term that was very important in form criticism, that is the notion of Sitz im Leben. You may remember that within form criticism, Sitz Leben is used to refer to the life experience of the community that gives rise to the particular literary expression that has been handed down orally and ultimately written down, and which is preserved for us in the texts of the scriptures. But within tradition criticism, Sitz Leben was no longer used to refer to the life experience of the community, but rather to the actual physical location of the community, the life setting in terms of the physical presence. And so Sitz Leben becomes a way of talking about the people groups who were located in a particular place. So if we think of the patriarchal period, we have patriarchal narratives that are focused on Shechem, others that are focused on Bethel, others centered in Hebron and Beersheba. And so each of these places and others, as tradition criticism develops, becomes a locus of tradition, because the different people groups who lived in these places had different ideas, and as they eventually merged together to become the people of Israel, those ideas evolved to the theology of the Old Testament as we have it. The person who took the first steps in this direction was the German scholar Albrecht Alt. And Alt is typically regarded as the father of tradition criticism, and was certainly the single individual most immediately associated with the rise of tradition criticism. His own doctoral dissertation from 1929, in English the title is The God of the Fathers, opened the door for the study of patriarchal religion, because he looked at this phrase, the God of the Fathers, which he saw as an essential theological tradition associated with the patriarchs. And so he, in a form critical way, attempts to explore the religious experience of the patriarchs and to reconstruct a picture of what patriarchal religion would have been like. So that's a quick look at the background that led to the developments that produced the technique or methodology that we call tradition criticism. The single most important proponent of tradition criticism was Gerhard von Rad. As a professor at a variety of universities in Germany throughout the middle and third quarter of the 20th century, von Rad, through his writings, became probably the most influential Old Testament theologian since Julius Wellhausen in terms of his overall effect on the way people thought about the Old Testament and talked about its theology. Among his earliest influential writings was an essay titled in English, The Form Critical Problem of the Hexateuch. It was written originally in 1938 as an essay, republished in English in a volume of collected essays from von Rad. And in this essay, von Rad argues that both form criticism and source criticism failed because they tended to focus on small-scale units, individual literary blocks, or individual text, or fragments of text. So as a result, von Rad observes, neither source criticism nor form criticism had been able to explain the overall structure and unity of the Pentateuch. And this is what von Rad sets out to do. He's interested in the big question of how the Pentateuch comes to have the shape, not just as literature, but also as theology, the shape that we encounter it in the texts that we have today. He attributes this process to the development of what was originally a creedal assertion preserved in Deuteronomy chapter 26, verses 5 to 9. This is the passage that begins, "My father was a wandering Aramean." And according to von Rad, it was this creedal assertion that provided the historical and theological foundation for the Hexateuch. Now, the key phrase here is the idea of historical and theological, because for von Rad, what distinguishes the theology of the Pentateuch is the historicization of the theology of these earlier traditions. Also, you'll notice von Rad talks about a Hexateuch. For reasons that we will deal with a little bit later, von Rad believed that the historical and theological traditions that make up the first epic of the Old Testament did not end with the book of Deuteronomy, but extended through the book of Joshua. And so he sees the book of Joshua as part of this Pentateuchal tradition, or Hexateuchal tradition, 6 books rather than 5. In other writings, von Rad fills out how he sees this happening. So in his commentary on Genesis, he offers a tradition-critical approach to the origins of the Torah, and in his Old Testament theology, he more specifically identifies the Yahwist, the author of the so-called J-source, the Yahwist, as the person who was the theological genius that created Israel's national theology by bringing together 2 different theological traditions and merging them into one historicized theology. And these 2 traditions were the Sinai covenant tradition, consisting of those tribes that in a nomadic way wandered through the deserts and had a religious tradition that associated them with a God who gave laws at Mount Sinai and who made a covenant with his people. The other part of this then was the Exodus conquest tradition, which was held by those people who left Egypt and came out of Egypt and came to Canaan and conquered the land and took possession of it. And it was the merging together of these 2 theological traditions, as the people who held them merged into one nation, the merging together of these 2 ideas by the Yahwist, that creates this national theology for Israel. In this way, the Yahwist becomes the central theologian of the Old Testament. He's the theological genius who creates Israel's national theology, and he does so by historicizing these older cultic traditions. And by that, he means he takes these older cultic traditions and sets them in the context of a historical narrative that expresses what God had done in bringing his people out of Egypt to Mount Sinai and to the land. This historicized theology, von Rad calls Heilsgeschichte, or salvation history. And it's this Heilsgeschichte, or salvation history, that for von Rad represents the central theology of the Old Testament and Israel's national theological constitution, and it is the product of the Yahwist. So that's a quick look at Gerhard von Rad's contribution to the development of tradition criticism.